Hey guys, so this week you're getting two videos. Today's video is going to be a Q&A for my patrons donating $5 or more. Tomorrow will be the same, but on a different topic. And the reason is because my patrons have pretty much asked me two sets of questions. One, which is random stuff, which is today's video, and tomorrow's video has got more of a theme. And it's very, very important. In fact, I'd probably say tomorrow's video, you'll see what I mean tomorrow when it comes up. So you're getting two videos this week. I hope you're happy with that. And let's get on to the questions. Jen says, can you talk a bit about the Russian winter of 1941? I've seen so many people say that the German invasion failed because they didn't invade early enough, so they didn't manage to reach Moscow before the winter came. And this is related to what Aaron says. I've been looking for information about the 1941-42 Soviet winter offensive, but I can't find much information about it. I can't find any books that only cover the offensives, and most books that cover the Battle of Moscow focus 90% of their attention on Operation Typhoon. Is there a reason there is so little written about it compared to Typhoon, Stalingrad, Kursk and other operations? Also, do you suggest any books or other sources on the winter offensive? So there is this idea that the Germans only lost because of the winter of 1941. And this is related to the Balkans. If they hadn't gone to the Balkans, we could have won because we only lost because the winter slowed us down. Well, this assumes that the winter slowed them down. But it didn't. So, Glantz, David Starhill, who's written a series on Barbarossa, others like them have come out and said, well, actually, they were losing way before this. I think Glantz is making the point that they lose pretty much the Battle of Smolensk, which is before Moscow, and before the winter as well. Starhill pretty much comes to the conclusion in his first book that the plan was just terrible to begin with, the Barbarossa plan. Halder shouts out in, I think, the first week of August and says, we've won! The first week of August, 1941. Thereabouts. It might be before or slightly afterwards. But yeah, that Halder comes out and says, we won in August of 1941. Guderian obviously doesn't admit that they, lost a lot. He loses half his tanks in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So, yeah. No, wait a second. This idea that they only lost because of the winter, that doesn't actually make any sense. When you look at the details of it, it doesn't make any sense. Now, the winter certainly didn't help, but they'd lost before this. The Balkans, yeah, it may have delayed things, but I don't think it did. When you look at the German preparation for this campaign, the Germans started preparing in 1940 after the French campaign. They were barely ready by the time Barbarossa began anyway, in terms of equipment and blah blah blah. They were barely ready. I'm not talking days. They could have attacked the day before. I'm pretty sure that would have been fine, but they attack in June because that's the best weather. Their plan was to defeat the Soviet Red Army in a matter of weeks, which they do, and then race off to victory. Well, what happens is they defeat the Red Army, and then there's another Red Army, and then another Red Army, and then another. So they're not able to defeat the Red Army because the reason the Soviets win is because they don't lose. I know this is how, nice one, TIK. But no, the reason they don't win is because they don't collapse. The Soviet Union does not collapse, which is what the Barbarossa plan said it would. That's why it failed. The Barbarossa plan is a flawed plan. It's terrible. We will defeat the Red Army and then we'll ride off into the sunrise. That doesn't make any sense. There's no... Look at the size of the Soviet Union. It's huge. There's no way they can get to the Pacific. And they just arbitrarily go, yeah, we'll draw a line from Arkhangelsk, how you say it, to Astrakhan. Well, even if you got to that line, there's nothing to say that the Urals, where there's tons of Soviet factories, because they move them all, isn't just going to, we're just going to surrender now. No, the Stalin and the Stalinist regime and the Red Army keep fighting. And this is what The Germans weren't. That's the last thing the Germans wanted, was the enemy not to surrender. In the West, you defeat them, around Dunkirk and whatever. You defeat the Western armies and they go, yay, we surrender now, except for Britain. But when a nation carries on fighting, then they've got a problem, because their plan was not set up for that. And you see this in the early campaign. They lose a lot of equipment, not too many men, but they lose a lot of equipment, and then they go, uh-oh, we've not gained victory here. And this is way before the winter. They were losing because the Red Army refused to just quit. And the Stalinist regime refused to quit. It's not because they won any battles, it's because they carried on fighting. And that's what the German plan just didn't foresee. And it's interesting because Paulus also then is the only general, as far as Stahl is concerned, is the only general who kind of foresaw that maybe the Soviets have got an extra 100 divisions behind the front line. And I think it ends up being more than that. It's probably 200 or something, but whatever. But Paulus is the only general who predicts maybe they've got some reserves. And he's the only one who thinks that. So it's a case of, it's... So Paulus isn't quite as bad as some people make him out to be. But yeah, there's definitely this idea that they would defeat the Red Army, then go to victory. It doesn't make any sense. That's where they lose. Their Barbarossa plan is pretty bad in that sense. Now, why do we not hear about the Moscow counteroffensive rather than... we hear about Stalingrad, we hear about Kursk, we hear about Typhoon, but we don't hear about the counteroffensive. I think there's a few factors behind this. One, the German generals weren't interested in what the Soviets were doing. All they needed to do was say, well, we lost, but only because Hitler didn't give us uniforms, winter uniforms, and he told us to stand fast, which is a stupid idea. We should have retreated, right? So the Germans are more concerned about what they're doing because they think the peasants of the Red Army aren't worthy of mention, okay? And the Soviets, this is a counteroffensive that works, but then it's a case of it also fails. It stops the Germans from getting to Moscow, technically, but it doesn't do much beyond that. It kind of only forces them back a bit, so it is a bit of a failure. So they have kind of unlike Stalingrad, where they surrounded the Sixth Army and then defeat basically two half army groups, and force them back. That's a definite victory. Another one, the Germans attacking Kursk, that's a definite victory. But they're not mentioning Moscow as much because it's not really something they need to talk about. So I think there's a combination of both sides don't really want to talk about it, and this is why Dubno isn't a thing. Battle of Dubno, one of the largest battles, if not the largest battle of the war, no one's talking about it because the Germans didn't want to talk about it because the guys who took part in it were all dead at Stalingrad, and the Soviets definitely want to talk about it because they lost all their tanks there. So it's a battle that's been lost to history until recently. And it's the same with this Moscow counteroffensive. There aren't really books out there. I haven't actually read any, and I can't really recommend you any. Stahl, maybe he's writing one at the minute, but his series stops at the Moscow counteroffensive. So I haven't really got any recommendations for you, but I think that's the reason why. It's just... And plus, there's not many books written on certain campaigns where things didn't happen. So, like, Rzhev... Yeah, it's there. There's a couple of books on it. I've got one here. But not many people want to talk about battles where things didn't achieve anything. Unless you're talking about the Western Front of World War I or Gallipoli. But, yeah, you don't really want to be talking about things that didn't achieve anything. So that's, I think, also another reason as to why. Sanders says, "Hi TIK, here comes a what-if question. What if the German army retreated to the pre-Barbarossa positions upon failure to take Moscow, maybe as early as November 1941. I think this was proposed by some generals, including very senior ones such as Lieb." I've not read a lot on Lieb, so I don't know exactly what his plan was, but I can probably tell you that if you're a leader of a nation, or if you're a leader of a party, or anything like that, or even, you don't even have to be a leader of a nation, you could be a leader of a business, or a leader of, an organisation, some sort of organisation somewhere, it doesn't really matter what, you do not want to admit that you have failed. And the reason is because it's going to impact the morale of the group. So, for example, a football team's not going to go, oh, we failed, we were such failures, I failed to get that goal. Ugh. No, because they've got to keep the spirit up, they've got to keep going. It's not, you don't want to admit your failures because you want to achieve something. So if the Germans had retreated to the beginning line, or let's say, or near it, that would have been an admission that they had failed. And because, as I say, the German idea was, we're going to get to Moscow, we got almost there, but the winter was the reason why we failed. It wasn't because of the Soviets. But if they had retreated, it would have been a case of, well, it's definitely the Soviets. So they can't retreat. And this is where 6th Army in Stalingrad in 1942, Hitler's got no excuse. They were forced out of the Caucasus and 6th Army is surrounded and destroyed. He's got no excuse for that. Whereas he does have an excuse in 1941. Or at least, he can say, well, we got stopped, but it was just a setback. So, and that's not as bad as, well, a total defeat. So I think that's the reason why. Now, I'm not talking about tactical retreats. They could retreat a little bit more if they wanted to. I think they probably would have got away with that. But I think going back to the beginning point, while it might have helped with the logistics, it certainly would have helped with morale, and it certainly would have helped at the home front. And even if they had done that, and it hadn't affected the morale, what are they going to do in 1942? They're going to have to attack again. Well, the armies are exhausted by end of 1941. But even so, they're just going to have a repeat of what happened the year before. They're not going to win because they've retreated to the 1941 border. So it doesn't quite make sense. But I haven't read Von Lieb, so maybe there might have been some sort of plan behind it. But certainly if I were just looking at it and thinking, well, that's not going to help the morale factor, it doesn't really, to me, it doesn't make any sense. Olaf says, assuming that an important objective of Barbarossa was to secure access to raw materials such as oil and grain, how did the Nazis initially try to accomplish that? Did they try to force a truce on the Soviet Union by capturing Moscow and get the Caucasian oil fields as a concession? Since they failed to accomplish this, was Fall Blau contemplated as an alternative to achieve their goal? Well, this again, Barbarossa plan. The idea is to smash the Red Army and then take everything. There is no, we're going to wait for the Soviets to truce out. I mean, if they truce out and they win, fair enough, but Hitler's idea is to just win. It's total victory. And there was no plan, as far as I'm aware, what to do if there wasn't total victory. So when they smashed the Red Army at first, it's like, yes, we're going to win. And the aim then, they smashed the Red Army in 6 to 8 weeks or whatever, and then they take Moscow, Caucasus, Leningrad, all the way up to this AA line. But when they smash it and they smash the Red Army, and then there's another Red Army, and then another Red Army, they're not able to just ride off and win. So the plan falls apart. And what you're probably thinking of, well, if we take Moscow, the Soviets will surrender. And this is the assumption everyone makes. And there'll no doubt be arguments in the comment section about this, but they didn't surrender at Minsk. They didn't surrender at Riga. They didn't surrender at all the cities, Kharkov, Kiev, Leningrad. Technically, they didn't take it, but they surrounded it. They didn't surrender when all these other cities fell. So why would they? And the people say about the railroads, and it's like there's more to it. I get it. It's a major hub, but taking that does not prevent. Look at the size of the Soviet Union; it is huge. Because the western portion has been taken, does not mean the rest will not carry on fighting. That's the point. It's not, oh, we've lost our western territory, let's surrender. It's not the same battle that's going on in France as it is in the Soviet Union. And you need to understand that the Soviets win this by not surrendering. So taking Moscow doesn't help, really. And to answer your second point, Olaf, the idea of foul blau, so Hitler realizes that 1941 campaign has failed, so and the army doesn't have the oil now, and lots of other factors. They can't just repeat the same style of war they had fought the year before, so they have to then pick and choose, and they choose to go south because Hitler, and this is where I'm agreeing with Hitler in the sense of his military strategic ideas. He has got the right idea in the sense of, well, we needed the food of the Ukraine and the Caucasus, and we need the oil of the Caucasus as well, so let's go south and take it. So 1941 is very much a case of we're going to win, we're going to totally win and win everything. 1942 is, okay, we're not going to win like that, but we are still going to win, and we're going to take the south, because if we take the south, that'll give us the resources we need to then continue the war and win maybe 1943. So that's the thinking of it. So it's not an alternative, it's a reality of the failure of the Barbarossa plan. I think that makes sense. I'm going to leave it like that. Ken says, how did the Soviets have enough fuel for the 42 to 45 offensives? We know they moved factories to the east and received Lend-Lease help, but their fuel pre-war must have been coming from the Caucasus. While the Germans didn't quite make it there, the increased consumption due to the war, the perils of transporting it around the German Bulge to the southeast in 41, the loss of European refineries had to have overtaxed their pre-war fuel supply chain, and yet they never seemed to lack fuel as they drove a huge tank and truck army to the west. Where did that fuel come from? How could they have had enough? So, Baku is definitely, I believe, is definitely the biggest oil-producing centre that the Soviets have, but it's not the only one. And the refineries in the Caucasus are actually quite important as well, and a lot of them do fall into German hands around Mayakop. So you're correct in assuming that the Soviets wouldn't have enough oil. But this area wasn't the only oil-producing place. There was oil-producing places in the Urals, and I believe a little bit further east as well. And you've got to look at two factors as well. So you have internal oil still being produced. Baku isn't taken. The Germans do take Mayakop, but not Grozny as well, although they do bomb it. So you've still got oil producing going on, but there's two things. One, Lend-Lease is definitely a factor. Absolutely 100% a factor. And it's some one of those things I am looking into. I'm going to look into it properly. But the Americans did definitely send oil to the Soviets, as well as trains and as well as trucks, boots, blah, blah, blah. So oil is definitely coming in. Fuel is definitely coming in for the Soviets via that, and it's a very big factor. But also the British. In the south, the British and the Soviets take Persia. I can't remember if it's called Iraq at the time. I think it was still called Persia. They take Iran, and Persia. They take that. I forget the name of their operation. Was it Continents or something like that? They take that and they split it in half. So oil can go around the Caucasus as well. And this is a very deliberate act by the British and the Soviets. It allows supplies to go between the two if needed. So I think there's a lot of... yeah, you're probably right. You probably need to look into this a bit more. But essentially, there is ways around the German Bulge in 1942. And it's a combination of these factors that continue the war effort for the Soviets. I don't know if Britain sent oil/fuel to the Soviets. That's something I don't know. But I definitely know the United States definitely did. And I think that's probably a big factor as well. Aaron says, I watched your video on Axis manpower during the 1942 campaign and how the Germans were replacing their losses but directing them to the wrong area, so reinforcing Army Group Centre instead of Army Group South. But David Glantz says that Hitler was told in late 1942, just before Uranus, that the Wehrmacht was 1 million men under strength. How was this possible? Was it because of the expansion of the German army, meaning that new units were being created and old ones were not getting reinforcements? Could you expand on this? Okay, so there's a couple of factors. One I'm going to say is, so let's imagine you've got a division at the front and it loses 100 men. Not a big deal, we'll just request a bunch of men from the Reich. So 100 men are down, you send 100 men from the Reich, they start going towards the front line, and it's going to take them, well, I mean, it took the Croatian Legion like 3 months, so let's say a month. I don't know how, maybe it's a month or 2 months before the reinforcements arrive. So there's a delay factor there. So the frontline units are always going to be less than what is being sent. So the Reich might go, well, we've sent enough reinforcements, but they've not all arrived yet, and therefore the units are still depleted. And you're never going to find a unit which has got 100% strength in the middle of a war. It's going to be very, very hard, unless they overdo it, but it's going to be very hard to do so because there's always going to be a truck that is broken down, or a guy that's ill, or a guy that's been wounded, or what. You're never going to have a division that's 100%. But I think there's a delay factor there, but it's not the only factor. Look into enduring the whirlwind for this answer. Total combat losses of the Oost front, I'm probably saying it wrong again, it's not Oust, it's Oost, between July and November 1942 numbered 498,000 men, but this was compensated by the arrival of 509,000. So we got a plus. However, the records of the organisation department of the OKH indicate that the total number of departures from the Oost here, during this period amounted to 856,000, implying that 357,000 sick had been repatriated to Germany. Although the veracity of this number of sick suggested by the OKH records might be suspect because this is contradicted by other information, and he has things in brackets, it is clear that the divisional shortages noted previously, that the quantity of arriving replacements was still insufficient. And he goes on to say, and this is the thing, actually I'll come back to that. So those statistics that I provided go, yes, they are receiving enough replacements, but what's the problem is those statistics don't report the sick. And there was a lot of sick in 1941. Off the top of my head, I think 700. Was it 700,000? Was it 300,000 and 700? There was a good chunk of sick in 1941. There's a good chunk of sick in 1942. Now these aren't permanent losses, and there's no reason to suspect that some of these won't go back to the front. But clearly there's a lot of sick, and these aren't combat losses. They're not wounded, they're not dead, they're not missing. We know where they are, but they're just not included. So there is actually a deficit, and it's actually because of sick. There's also a couple of factors I didn't mention in the video, so I'm just going to quickly do them now. There is the idea that there are waves of reinforcements, so effectively, you think about it, the Germans are going to attack in the summer, so they want their troops to be in the summer, and they don't need them in the winter. Now in 1941, the idea was that they would win the campaign within a couple of months and send the troops home. Not all of them, but a good portion of them home. And Hitler makes a deal with the industrialists to say, hey, we will be, let's say October, we'll be sending a good portion of our army home, and they will go to the factories and work and produce the weapons to continue the war. And this is actually agreed. So there are portions of the German army which is actually going back home, and that also causes problems, but they might be down in December, but might still receive all the reinforcements needed by the summer again. So there is definitely a depletion, but the point is that overall, over a course of, let's say, a year, they are still replacing their losses. And there's also another factor as well, which I'll get into in the video. Given the scale and intensity of the fighting in the East, some degree of personal deficiencies within the German army was inevitable. But the magnitude of the problem rested upon the efficient utilisation of manpower resources rather than their actual availability. In this regard, Germany's military and political leaders are to blame because of their abysmal management of the situation. In response to the crisis that erupted during the winter of 1941-42, the generous deferral qualifications that had exempted 5.5 million German males from military service were tightened, and during the next 3 months the number of deferments declined by roughly 360,000. And he goes on to say, well, basically, the Germans had the manpower in the Reich. They just weren't releasing it to the army. But then, as I say, the reason why you've got deficiencies at the front is probably a combination of a delay of reinforcements getting to the front, and also, so that, you know, oh, we've sent you 1,000 men, oh, we're still 1,000 men short. There's going to be a problem there. But also, the sick, which isn't included in the statistics I've used, but again, that's not combat losses, that is generally just sick. And again, even if they're sick, they may not have been deported back to the Reich, they may have just, you know, what's going on there? It's a whole, this is where statistics fall down. But at the same time, the overall losses, because people like to argue this, that the Germans didn't have enough manpower, they did. It's just, they did. It's stupid to say they didn't. They did. So, yeah. Sparky Boomer says, "Hi TIK, you mentioned that the Wehrmacht has long-suffering issues with logistics. Can you further elaborate about their issues with logistics and the apparently long-suffering logistics officers who are seemingly constantly ignored?" This is kind of related to what Craig asked. Who were the people responsible for rear echelon logistical security? I know the Lockhart autonomy were allowed to exist because they did anti-partisan duty, but in what way did they do that function? Any information about that or on similar regions will be great. This is something I've started gathering books on. In fact, I've got a few ordered. So I'm not going to go into this too much yet. But the guy you need to look into is Wagner, if you're English. Wagner. Wagner, he is... This is the thing. So Germany invaded the Soviet Union with 4 army groups in 1941. North, South, Centre and Rear. They actually had it's not really technically an army group, but it's basically they have a rear sections area. And from what I can kind of gather, because I need to look into this, Wagner and Heydrich, SS Heydrich, are chatting about this in like April of 1941. They say they come to an agreement, like, we're going to share responsibility for the area in the front. And Wagner is in charge of the rear area organisation. So the security divisions, things like that. He's the one in charge of the logistics. He is the Quartermaster General of the OKH, I believe. And he's in charge of the logistical things. He's the one who says we can only go so far into the Soviet Union before our fuel fails, and that's exactly what happened. So he predicts that, and he's the one in charge of the rear area security overall. So that's the guy you need to start looking into if you want more information about it, and that's what I'm definitely going to do. So after I did the video, I decided to go back and just do a bit more research on this and actually give you a proper answer. So here's a bit more information that you can take away and think about. So prior to Barbarossa, the Army High Command assumed that the ammunition expenditure would be no greater than that during the Battle of France. It also assumed that most of the food stocks for the troops would come from the land in the east, not by rations sent from Germany. So basically, they would be relying on the land. And it also assumed that the Red Army would be destroyed before they reached the Dnieper-Dvina line, which is 2 rivers in Russia. Now, they only actually had 3 months' worth of fuel stocks. And there was also a shortage of rubber for both tyres and also metal tank tracks, which apparently needed rubber padding. So, to quote the official German history, overall it had to be assumed that there would be a fuel shortage by July at the latest, which is interesting because I said October. So now Wagner, this is all according to the official German history, Wagner has no choice but to just assume that supplies from the Reich would not be sufficient, and so concludes that the Wehrmacht would have to live off the land. He also says that he also knew that the Soviet railway system was small and of a different gauge, and that actually forces the Germans to rely more on motor vehicles, which then increases the fuel costs. But due to a lack of motor vehicles, 77 infantry divisions would have to rely on horse-drawn transport, and each received 200 wooden peasant carts. Now, even with all this, overall the Germans had a 20,000 ton haulage capacity for each army group. However, half of this, so roughly 10,000 tons, was from trucks, which is roughly 70 tons per division per day, even though a mobile division required 300 tons of supplies per day, roughly. So, and if you think about the fact that they are advancing, this means that the lorries would have to go even further every single trip, because as the front lines get further and further away from Germany, yeah, they're going to be stretched and stretched and stretched. So it was calculated in order for them to go 1,000 kilometers, they would need 10 times the number of trucks that they actually had. So Wagner kind of concludes that with the current system, they would go probably about 500 kilometers into the Soviet Union, at which point they would have to stop and wait for the railways to catch up before they could go any further. And according to the official German history, at best they could hope for 20 kilometers of railways to be laid in a 24-hour period, but this was at optimum capacity. The official German history also concludes that supply problems began to emerge in October 1941, which is coincidentally when they also ran out of fuel. And Ostkrieg, or Auskrieg, however you say it, says that 3/4 of German supply trains were put out of action in December 1941 because of the cold and the partisans. So things got even worse. So Wagner definitely knew before the operation began that 500 kilometers was as far as they were going before they had to wait for the trains. And he told his masters this, and they kind of just said, well, it's fine, don't worry about it, we're going to win in the first few weeks anyway. Okay. But they did prepare for rear area security, so I'm going to read a big quote now from the German official history. It was the task of the military command authorities in the rear area of operations to secure supply bases, supply routes, railway lines, lines of communications, vital airfields, and captured camps, as well as guard and evacuate prisoners of war. Particular attention was paid to the supply bases. The commanders of the rear army areas had a variety of forces available to fulfill these tasks: security and order troops, security divisions and regiments, field and local commanders' agencies, units of the field gendarmerie and secret field police, and staffs for prisoner assembly points and transit camps. Where necessary, the commanders were also authorized to call on units of the Waffen-SS and regular police, which had been deployed in their areas and were subordinate to the local higher SS and police leader for security tasks. So yeah, I think we can safely conclude there's a lot of guys behind the lines doing behind the lines things, and this is, related to the partisan problem as well as the final solution and so on and so forth. So it's quite a big question, and I'm gonna have to look into it, but I will, as you'll see with my commitment that I'm going to make tomorrow. In terms of Craig's question with the low-carb autonomy and so on, and anti-partisans, again, this is all related to this because they're all fighting behind the scenes. Let me put it this way. Up until recently, I had 2 pages on this and all the literature behind me. The official German history from 1942 gives it 2 pages, and the rest is pretty much all about frontline duty. I have started gathering books on this, and I do want to, do a video on it, certainly, and it's going to be related to the topic that I'm discussing tomorrow, as you will see. So I'm giving a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but if you want to know more, Wagner is probably the guy to go to, and I can't give you that yet because I haven't studied it. So, not ideal, I understand that, but you'll see tomorrow why I'm not going too far into this question today. Decabra says, "Hey TIK, it's World War II related, but I'm not entirely sure if it's your field. There's a blog called Tank Archives. This blog mostly revolves around armoured warfare and digging up documents about it. Heavy focus on Soviet documents. Some people are calling this blog a liar for various reasons, the main being too positive about Soviets, while it's just analysis, reviews, shooting range tests, etc. And the fact that most of the documents are written by Soviets, so it's made out of lies to prove how great Soviet engineering and industry were. What would be your thoughts on the Soviets lying on purely internal documents?" It's not entirely World War II related, technically, but it is definitely in my field. Any historian should tell you the same thing. History is written by somebody. And I know this sounds stupid, but, you got prehistoric. They call it prehistoric. What does history mean? History is his story, my story. I've written something down. This is history. That's what history is. So when you're talking about the history of the Earth, it's not actually history. It's kind of... There needs to be another word for it, because history is written down. The Earth did not write down what happened 4 million years ago. Okay, so the history is kind of like what happened. Yeah, there are historians who look back on that, but you think about prehistory, so before the written word, that's called prehistory. So yeah, every single document, every single photograph, this video, audio, everything is taken by somebody or something. Something has recorded it down. Hopefully it's a human. And every single human is an individual. Every single human has a different perspective on everything. So every single book here is written by different historians. They have different perspectives. Their sources that they use are all different. But every single human's got biases. Every single human's got agendas, sort of. Depends. But you should always look into this. You should always ask the question, well, who are these people that are writing the histories? Not just what is the history telling us. So, are the Soviets lying? Well, maybe. Are they lying in internal documents? Well, they've got less incentive to do that, but they still could be lying. But then the same question could be applied to the Germans. The same question should be applied to the Americans and the British and whoever, whatever state you think of, everybody. And it's not just the state, it's the people in there. So what you're saying about, they have probably less incentive to lie in internal documents because it's not propaganda being given to the masses. So yeah, there's an element of, well, we can probably trust it a bit more, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is correct, because you need to look at what the author is, what he's saying, who he is, who she is, whatever. That you've got to go, well, okay, so, I don't know, Ian Kershaw, what's his background? Is he American? Is he Soviet? Is he what? Can he speak Soviet, Russian? Can he speak German? No, in this case. And you ask the question because you need to know who the author is. This is why it's very important about using your sources, citing your sources, because you need to know who these people are. And it may not even be Kershaw's fault that things go wrong, because he might be using sources that are corrupt and blah, blah, blah. So there is that. So what I'm going to say to you is this. If you are going onto this Tank Archives blog thing, that's fine. But here's the deal. You need to know who the authors are, what their incentive is, what, biases they may have, have they got an agenda? Is this I don't know. Is this a communist sort of blog spot? Who's running it? What are their personal motivations? What perspectives do they have? But also then think outside the box and go, okay, I don't know what this site is. Let's say they were testing the cannon of a T-34. A bit more realistic, actually. Let's say they were firing a rifle. Let's say they were Mosin rifle, they're firing it, okay? The question you need to ask is, well, what ammunition are they using? Is it the same ammunition that was from the day? Is it a replica ammunition? Who manufactured this ammunition? Blah, blah, blah. Because I've been watching what's his name? I've been watching a channel recently on guns, and the guy's an expert. He's military, and he says in one of the videos, every single round can be different. It can give you different results, and therefore it's okay to look at the millimeters and penetration and so on, but you can't trust it like 100%. It's not going to be super accurate. One round might go through, another round might not go through, etc. Or one round might hit 1,000 yards or whatever, and another one might not. And my video next week, which is going to be on tanks and anti-tank warfare, is going to... So watch next week's video. So it's going to be talking about millimeters and so on. But I'm not going to be super accurate with it because there's no point. I go, well, it's about 50 millimeters. Why? Because every single round, even the sheet of metal that you're firing at could be slightly different in a way, depending on the metal, or is it compressed or whatever? Is it a certain type of alloy? It could have a different impact on the round. So that I would very much ask, who are they? What are they doing? So on and so forth. Generally, I would say internal documents are probably slightly more reliable than propaganda, obviously, and you certainly should. If you've got no other statistic, you're going to have to use something, because you've got to. And this is where they've argued with me in the past and said, well, no, the Soviets are definitely lying. And like, well, you find me statistics, and the best they can come up with is the German statistics. Like that doesn't count, because they're just guessing in a sense. They're not. You've got to take something. Yeah. If you use a set of statistics and it turns out there's a better set of statistics, change your grab that one and change your opinion on it. But yeah, you're going to have to trust something at the end of the day. And this is why I don't get behind the idea of, well, Kavalerchik is right, or Krivoshev is right with his statistics. And then some people argue with my statistics and whatever. And I've just said before about the losses, and no doubt people will now be complaining in the comment section saying, well, you didn't take this into factor. So if a new set of statistics come along, you're going to have to assess it and blah, blah, blah. But I would be very much wary, just simply because of the type of ammunition or whatever they're doing, the reviews. I'd ask them who they are, what they're up to, what is their agenda, blah, blah, blah. Because they could be super pro-Soviets and bias and agenda and be messing up the statistics. They could be using new ammunition if they're firing the rifles or whatever, which might have a different penetration power or whatever, or range. You don't know. Is it replica guns, blah, blah, blah. So you're going to have to ask all these questions and think outside the box. Are the tests that they're doing relevant? Are they accurate? So that's my advice to it. I don't know about that specifically, but that's my advice. You should always, and this is what history teaches us. History teaches us you've got to question everything. But is this really the case?
Alexandra says, a couple of questions connecting Stalingrad and the theory of urban warfare. 1. To what degree were both sides applying doctrines or models of urban warfare, if it existed by then? 2. To what extent did Stalingrad develop or evolve each side's understanding of urban warfare? And 3, which is a clickbaity question, how much did the Battle of Berlin owe to the Battle of Stalingrad in terms of urban warfare doctrine from either side?
I don't know how much they knew, but I don't think the Germans had a urban warfare doctrine, and I don't think the Soviets had either. And even if they did, I don't think, because Churikov's army, 62nd Army, was a reserve army prior to Stalingrad. It had been, I think it was the 7th Reserve Army or something, and then it was turned into the 62nd Army. And I don't think that army was really suited to urban warfare, because it certainly started its fight outside the city and then went into the city. And Churikov definitely was inventing things on the fly, the storm group ideas and so on. So I don't think they were really applying anything like that prior to this. Now, the Germans are certainly trying to, with the pincer movements in Stalingrad, they're trying to do what they did on the open steppe, but inside Stalingrad. So are they really going for an urban warfare doctrine thing? It's not really clear. Did it really develop each side's understanding of the urban warfare? Again, probably not. Certainly not for certainly not for the Germans, because their guys all died. Their guys all died in Stalingrad. So how much lessons they got from that, I'm not sure. Both sides saw it as like a battle of Verdun, but in the east at Stalingrad, they saw it as the Battle of Verdun in a sense. Just a very intense action in a not confined area, but a small area of the front. That's how they kind of saw it. They saw it as this meat grinder. And did it impact the doctrine of urban warfare? I mean, you hear all the time about people studying Stalingrad in order to learn from that to apply urban warfare. And so maybe in the future, but did it then impact the Battle of Berlin? Not really, because Churikov's army, what was left of it at the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, was pretty bad. There was not a lot left. It was remnants. And then they formed the 8th Guards Army. They probably got reinforced and so on. But by the time you get to Berlin, except for probably Churikov and a few others, there's not going to be a lot left that survived the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalin, I believe, wanted Churikov at the Battle of Stalingrad, at the Battle of Berlin, so that he could say the Stalingrad army had fought at both battles, so it's like a symbolic thing. But the Battle of Berlin is nothing like Stalingrad. I think the Battle of, 2 weeks? I don't think the Battle of Berlin is anything like Stalingrad. The German army's remnants at this point, it's really defeated on the Oder. What's left? I mean, there's a few centres of resistance, and it's certainly a tough fight, but it isn't the same thing. What I will say though, and I don't know if this is probably not tactics, but the Germans at Stalingrad are forced to go into the city. They try and do the whole pincer movement, and they're not able to do that. So they go into the city as a flat thing. And 62nd Army doesn't get its supply base cut off. It sort of does, but not properly. So it's able to survive and keep fighting and keep getting reinforced and whatever else. So it's pretty much an attritional mash of a fight. When you get to when you get to the Battle of Berlin, the Soviets pretty much go like this, and they eat Berlin. They prevent, there isn't a case of the Germans can keep reinforcing Berlin. I mean, there's nothing left anyway, but assuming they even could, let's say the rest of Germany was fine, they couldn't reinforce Berlin because the Soviets had surrounded it and were coming at them like crocodile teeth. They were coming at them on all sides. So perhaps the Soviets learn operationally that's what we need to do in order to take Berlin. But I don't know is the answer to the, did it affect them? I think you're thinking tactically, did it affect them tactically? I'm not entirely sure, if I'm honest. If there's a book out there that says it, great. I would love to read that book though. But I haven't actually specifically seen anything on urban combat in the Second World War, specifically. But maybe there is something out there. Maybe I'll have to check it out.
Milan asked, "Hey TIK, my question is, are you going to further specialise on the Eastern Front, especially bringing Russian sources to the English-speaking audience? I feel like this is a huge gap waiting to be filled, as there is bound to be a treasure of knowledge, and the Western plus German narratives and views are heavily overrepresented."
Yes. Done. That's the end of that question? No, I'm kidding. Yeah, okay, so I want to bring... I think it's right that people should bring Russian to the English sources, because there isn't any. There isn't, in English, there's literally Zhukov. I found a copy of Churikov's memoirs. There's probably a few others. Rokossovsky's got a book and so on, but it's so little. Whereas Rommel's got 1 million books written on him. You've got Guderian and Manstein. They've got their memoirs out. There's a lot going on with the German sources, but not so much the Soviet. And I get it, there's a Cold War, or there has been a Cold War, and there still is probably, and people are generally not trustworthy of the Soviets, but this is actually, you need to be suspicious, but you can't not use the Soviet sources. This is where people get it wrong. You have to use both. You have to. It doesn't matter. Just because you read the Soviet sources doesn't mean, oh no, I'm going to believe everything they said. People think that you're going to do that. No, you compare and contrast. You go, well, the Germans said this, the Soviets said that. Where do they meet? Okay, and it's that interpretation. That's what historians do. So if you've got two German let's say you've got two German generals that disagree with each other, who do you believe? Well, one's clearly lying, right, or whatever. So you've got to interpret that. And the same thing goes with the Soviets. It's not two German generals; it's one Soviet and one German general. And everyone thinks, well, you got to side with the German. It's like, well, no, not necessarily. The Red Army guy could have not been lying, and you need to give them some trust in order to get something out of it. And yeah, I definitely think that there needs to be more Russian and Soviet history books in English. There just isn't any. There really isn't any. And those that have, I've said about the Battle of Dubno, this book is terrible. The language translator, Kevin Bridge, you suck. Right? You could have done it so much better than that, right? Instead of just direct, I think he just used Google Translate. That's each individual word and just, there you go, there's a book. That's what it feels like to me anyway. So Kevin Bridge, you suck. But there's only a handful of Soviet sources. I'm looking all the time for new books and stuff, and it's like, there isn't any, there's nothing. So yeah, I think that's right. Now I am learning German at the minute. Sprechen Sie Deutsch nicht gut. But, I said on Patreon, listen, if I get so much, I'll learn the Russian. Unfortunately, I think it's a bad idea to learn Russian and German at the same time. I've started with German now, and I'd rather stick with that until I get a decent grasp of it. But my intention is to learn German, my intention is to learn Russian, and then I obviously have English, although I still need to learn that as well. And then I'll have all three languages, and I'll be able to, dive into everything. But I think this is where the Cold War has very much impacted our perceptions of the Eastern Front of World War II. It definitely had. I mean, we call it the Eastern Front for a reason, because it's the German perspective. It's Axis Soviet Front. It's the Axis Soviet Front. And there was a conversation today in the comments. I read it, don't worry. I was wrong. All right. But yeah, generally, our perception is from the German perspective in the West, and it's not necessarily true. And the Cold War's had an impact on that, and it's not necessarily right. The Soviets aren't always lying. And even if they are, you can see through it. So we've got to use those sources. We have to use those sources. It's the right thing to do.
Curran asked a bunch of questions, one of them being, aside from his sick moustache that caused the Germans to get lost in it, what do you think of Budyonny? I used to think he was a pure idiot, then I read a bit more about his time at Northern Caucasus Front, where he didn't do too poorly. On top of that, and of course it's biased, but his and his kids' memories apparently point out he actually wasn't opposed to tanks like Western historiography generally claims.
I mean, you can't compete with the moustache, man. You just can't. There's nothing you can do. We're all inadequate compared to this guy. Somebody said he's like the Holzendorf of the World War II. It's probably true, I don't know. But this guy, Budyonny, how you say his name, he is a cavalryman. He also has his impact prior to the war. He's involved in the purges, I believe. If I remember, memory's gone. Can't remember properly. I'm going off memory here. But yes, I think he's got involvements in that as well. Now, he may not necessarily be opposed to tanks, certainly by 1942 standards he shouldn't be, but he is very much against it beforehand. We got to remember, we're in the era where horses, if you think back in history, 99.9% of history has all been about men on horseback and guys on foot with spears, right? So you just hit an era where the horse is going out of fashion, in a sense. It's no longer quite as relevant as it once was. And it's hard to give that up, especially when you've been trained and that has been your career to be a horseman. For the British generals, there was this big sort of they had a cavalry division in World War II, and it was converted it was in Palestine. It was converted into I believe an armored division. So yeah, this was the end of an era in a sense. Now I know the Soviets still use cavalrymen, they use Cossacks, blah blah blah, but I think there is a reaction to this idea of using the tank rather than the horse. And being a cavalryman, you may have a different perception of what you need to do with the tank. Cavalry all gathered together, they would charge the enemy, and yay. That's not what a tank should be doing. Not in 1942 when he's in the Caucasus. Not in 1941. The Germans have already learnt this, and I'll talk about this more next week. But you need to use combined arms warfare in order to win. So while he's not necessarily against it maybe at this point, I suspect that he is certainly not going... He's not going to have the experience with the tanks that he needs. And this is what's been found, as I say, in the British, in North Africa, in Operation Crusader, which is going to come out soon. The British generals are either infantrymen, artillerymen, or cavalrymen. There is no tank man, except for Gatehouse, but he's only a brigadier. There's no tank men at Operation Crusader, and it definitely tells. It definitely has an impact on the battle, because these generals are just not used to it. They are not used to the tank. They don't understand it as much. Auchinleck was from the Indian Army, and they don't have tanks in 1940 or 41. So he's no experience with tanks. And the same thing again with this guy. This guy is not a tank man, so he may not necessarily be against it. I haven't read anything specific on him, but I suspect he's not got the experience that is needed in order to command these units. So my thoughts on him is that this guy may have been good at infantry and or defending the Caucasus and so on, and that's fine. And he might have been a good organizer, and he's obviously got a lovely moustache, but he probably wasn't very good with tanks. And yeah, Western historiography, don't know. I mean, maybe Soviet historiography might be different, but I suspect that he's not going to be an expert with tanks because he isn't a tank man. It's as simple as that.
Timo said, how is your German coming along? What is the first German source you want to use once you master the language enough?
Yeah, as I said just a second ago, ich spreche Sie Deutsch nicht gut. Ich habe so many, don't know what so many is. Geschichtsbücher, yeah! Ich lese the Geschichtsbücher. I bought this one ages ago. Stalingrad, Mythos and Wirklichkeit einer Schlacht by Wolfram Vetter. There's a few guys in this one, but Wolfram Vetter, the Wehrmacht, History, Myth and Reality. This is all about the Nazi atrocities in the East. See tomorrow's video. Same guy writes in this as well. I'd love to be able to read it in the natural language. Apparently, according to Military History Visualized, reading German history books is impossible. So, we'll see. But it's like they're talking in a different language altogether. Maybe that's true. And so, but that is one book I'd like to read. I have, just the other day, received this. The Panzer und der Mechanisierung des Kriegers. Basically, history of the Panzers between 1890 and 1945. Ooh. So these two books I would love to read. Am I anywhere near reading these? Nope. Nope. I'm getting there. I recognise the odd word off the back of the cover. But these are the books that I'd like to read. This one was recommended to me by Jeff, and I think this is one which Military History Visualized uses, so that's why I've got it. But yeah, no, this is encouragement. These two books, these are the ones I want to read, basically.
Ricky said, what books would you recommend for the North African theatre in World War II?
I don't know if I have answered this before, so I'm going to answer it now. Yes, absolutely. I can recommend to you a series of books, which are probably the best on it overall. Barry Pitt's Crucible of War, Wavell's Command, book number 1. Crucible of War, Auchinleck's Command, book number 2. And Crucible of War, Montgomery and El Alamein, book number 3. Now, here's the problem with this one. It's the only problem with it. It doesn't list its sources. Cheers, Barry Pitt. Piece of... Anyway, it doesn't list its sources. However, I can confirm that it's basically using... It's using the primary sources, obviously. It's also using the British official history. It goes a bit more in depth with that in the particular battles. So while technically I should be going, and if I ever do a book review of that series, I will tell you, yeah. But I can tell you that he's not wrong in what he's saying. Now, some of the details might be wrong, and he should have definitely included a bibliography. But I can tell he's not a million miles off. Some of these other books, like, just don't even bother. This book does list its sources, and it's terrible. Absolutely terrible. So, absolutely 100% I would get the Barry Pitt books. You could get the British official history, and that's fine. It's very expensive if you do, but I recommend it. The only problem with it is that Playfair is pretty terrible as a historian. In the sense of, as a historian he's great, he's just terrible at writing. For example, support group was in Compass, but he doesn't mention who's in charge of it until book 2. And the guy in charge of it is none other than Sir Arthur Gott. One of your big important character in the... It's like, why didn't you tell me this in book 1, you... So, yeah, Barry Pitt's books, definitely. Even though it's not got the bibliography, which is stupid, but yeah, I would recommend that one.
Gregory McKay said, "Hi TIK, a while ago you asked for decent books about the various tanks that were involved in the battles and campaigns that you discuss. Were you able to find any good books or papers on this subject, and if so, what were they?"
No. No, I didn't. I didn't find anything. This is why I said I'll do a tank video. I can't, because none of the information is available. I have ordered some more books that are on the way about some tanks. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, they will actually be useful. But I can honestly tell you that this series, Osprey Publishing New Vanguard series, it's just, there's very little... Actually, to be fair, this one's not too bad. The other ones are terrible. This one's actually got tables in it. The other ones don't even tell you. You got to look through. It's kind of like the Battle of Doomno book. You got to look through everything and calculate for yourself, because apparently these historians can't do that. I know one of these books is by David Fletcher. That's not actually too bad. Even though when I met him at Tankfest, he said that the publishers had messed it up. So I don't know what the problems with that. But overall, no, I haven't actually found. That's why I haven't done a tank video. Next week's video will be on tanks and anti-tank tactics. And I'll be taking a lot of information from these books in order to give you that. But no, not really. And these to me have been a kind of a waste of money, really. Even though they're pretty cheap. But I'd rather get a proper decent history book rather than spend money on these. So I cannot recommend them. And yeah, if I do find any, I will let you know.
One of Jen's other questions was, what's your opinion on alternative history, as in self-described educational channels who do nothing but speculate about what if Germany won the Battle of Stalingrad?
Okay, alternate history. So referring to normal history, you can always ask the question, or what happens if this happens? Or what's the best way that they could have won this? So, for example, Stalingrad. How could the Germans have won it? I would probably say that they should have won it out. They lost because the outside of the city, what's going on outside the city. So if they'd have won this and had done this differently or whatever, then taking Stalingrad would have happened. So, if only they'd done that, they would have taken Stalingrad. Great. Beyond that, can't predict it. 1942, if they'd taken the Caucasus, that would have given them the best chance of them winning. I can confidently say that because that's true. The Germany needed the oil, right? And you can also say, well, the Soviets were on the brink of collapse in 1942, so therefore, if you take the Caucasus and most of the oil, and as well as the food, there's little chance of the Soviets from, having enough oil in 1942, and thus that could have caused the collapse of the economy, blah, blah, blah. That's something you could say, but you can't predict that that's what's going to happen. You can't say 1943, June 1943, Soviet Union collapses. You can't do that because you don't know. It could have survived to 1944, it could have survived to 1945, but you can confidently say Germany would have had the best chance of winning if they'd taken the Caucasus. So this is where alternate history goes way beyond. I saw a video once, oh wow, it's years ago. I saw a video once where it was basically like, it starts off and the first thing it says is like, Russia conquers China. And like, what? Where did that come from? Like, it's like completely out there. And this is where, oh, well, if this had happened, Japan wins in China. Like, they might have won another battle. But you can't predict the whole of a country being swallowed up. Maybe a little country somewhere. Luxembourg takes over the world, But you can't predict huge countries getting swallowed up in an instant. And yet that's sometimes what alternate history does. Oh, a bubonic plague opens up in Poland. It's like, where did that come from? So it doesn't. There's a point, okay. And I think because we can't predict the future, you're talking. All right, maybe you can predict the next month, but then beyond that, it's total rubbish, So what's my opinion on it? I personally think it's kind of stupid. Basically, it's I think there's war games and Hearts of Iron 4. Oh, what happens if I do? That's good. But these channels, educational channels that as you say, that's all they do. It's lazy. I could do that. Oh well, how Germany took Britain in 1941. Didn't therefore need to go to war with the Soviet Union. Therefore, lived forever. It's like, yeah, but how do you take Germany? How does Germany take Britain in 1941? And even if they did that, it just no. It's lazy history. It's not even history. It's just rubbish. It's make believe. It's fiction. It is fiction, and these channels that do it. Well, I don't watch any anymore. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to leave it there. But tomorrow's video is still happening, and you'll definitely want to see it because it's going to be interesting. It may, if you come to my channel tomorrow and it's not available at 5 PM, it's been taken down. I'll leave it like that. Yeah, let's just leave it like that. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting if you're a patron, and bye for now.